Um, Hello and welcome to Monarchism Unfiltered. I'm one of your hosts, McCosk.
I am.
This is me, Bronze.
And on today's episode, we're finally breaching the big one. Our introductory episode on what not hopefully we know it'll be an almost suddenly 800,000 part series on the topic of feudalism. Have mercy upon our souls.
So some of the members that have been on the Discord, they might have seen the whiteboard, the Microsoft Office whiteboard document of doom. But don't worry, this is not the one, because it's unless we're here 7 hours later. This is
Well, at that point, I'll just go to sleep.
Exactly. This is probably not that one, but
yeah,
essentially it's like feudalism. Did it exist? Maybe. If it did, what was it?
So,
Sort of vaguely, in broad strokes.
yeah. So, I think to begin with, I think we should probably discuss like the area that feudalism exists in. I'm of the opinion that feudalism was a thing, that there was a broadly distinct social system that we could characterize as feudalism in Europe. McCosk is quite staunchly against this idea. For I don't know, whatever reason
I'm somewhere in the middle, but
yeah.
So we keep.
I think fundamentally that feudalism describes a system of government or a system of socio-economic organization that existed like up to Poland and Hungary, excluding the Balkans, and that sort of, except for like the Balkans coastline, I think we can reasonably say that was somewhat feudal, though there you get into sort of classical republicanism, and I think if you look at the socio-economic systems that existed in Russia and the Muslim world, there you can see quite different forms of social organization. In Russia, it's sort of still tribal or like semi-tribal, so largely focused around like extended family units, rather than around a person who you are not necessarily blood related to, as you see in a lot of feudal countries where you have indentured servants working for someone who they are not necessarily blood related to.
Just to clarify, like this is talking about. I assume like the Kievan Rus period vaguely, and before that, because when you get later into the appanage period, that's not part of this episode because it gets very complex.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, by like increasing the after, say, I like Ivan the Terrible or whoever, like then it is sort of distinctly like serfs, and I mean Russians themselves in the 19th century explicitly talk about serfdom and think that they have serfs and think that they're a feudal system, which I think
that all of that probably is going to be in a different episode because that's a whole. But
that's another.
essentially, we're putting that aside for now. Russia pre-Mongol invasion for certain is not feudalist.
No, but I'm pretty sure I can name drop a few Soviet historiographers that will say, from the Scythians down, it's all feudal.
Okay, but that's like That's a bit of a meme, I think. I
Yeah,
think
the Soviet historiographers are a bit of a meme.
yeah. I mean, next you're going to be pulling out, I don't know, like Soviet psi research or something, like Soviet psionics research, and be like, that prove, or Lysenko to disprove Darwin.
It would be best if I did manage to do that, however.
Yeah, I mean, but that would be outside of the scope of the episode. I think, yeah, I mean, especially if you compare, I think especially if you compare the Muslim world to sort of to Europe, especially sort of Catholic Europe, well, Germany, France, England, and like Poland, Hungary. Those places are very clearly distinct socioeconomically from the Muslim world, from how Muslim societies organize themselves from the Umayyads on, where there is this very hard shift towards slave labor, and if not slave labor, then kind of highly basically like the I mean it's sort of a very different system of government that is much more sort of government heavy than
based on much more urbanized and bureaucratized than the comparable for a long while actually than comparable European regimes.
And even in the case where it's urbanized, because you do get like high medieval Germany or high medieval Italy are relatively urbanized, all things considered, probably not as urbanized as say Egypt, but they're still very decentralized. Every town is essentially a law unto itself, especially post Matilda, post Duchess Matilda, Italy.
I mean, have you finished your piece? Since like this
I mean, I'm sort of
so it existed somewhere in the region of Western to Central Europe. Western and Central Europe is the area, and there's several definitions of what it was, and the most common one is sort of the classic definition, which comes from the medievalist Francois Louis Gansoff, and he says that it's this set of reciprocal legal and military obligations. Essentially, that there exists a king or equivalent at the top. He has obligations to military nobility below him. The vassals, and the knights, and they have obligations to the king. And then they also then have obligations to their own vassals and so forth. And that this set of obligations is feudalism. Marc Bloch, he goes further. He accepts Gansoff's definition, but he says that feudalism also critically involves a tripartite division into estates, which is the nobility, the clergy, and those who labor, which most often is the peasants. And that these estates are bound by the related but not a system of manorialism, which is related to feudalism but does not mean the same thing. And so, like, where the boundary lies is also another thing that could become very vague. So it might not be part of this video.
Another thing to add to what Bronze has said, on regards to the third estate, it's a small aside, but the concept of the third estate actually was not a static concept, and it evolved through its own existence. You had the early notion of the three estates encapsulated by the notion of the oratori, bellatori, laboratori, which is those who pray, those who fight, those who work. And in this early conception, these three states was not were all equal in theory, and depending upon the region, in practice as well. In terms of like importance to society, without one of them, society would basically collapse. One was not inherently organized. One was not inherently positioned in front of the other. The notion of first estate, second estate, and third estate came later. I'm not exactly sure when, but I would feel comfortable to put it on like post Renaissance, since or at least after the Black Death. Well, in fact, it's probably after the Black Death.
Well, after the Black Death, there's like an increasing hardening of what we would now consider feudalism. I mean, sort of a lot of serf laws come in that crack down afterwards.
True.
Because I mean but I think even prior to that, sort of in the hundreds of years, it's sort of within the sort of the 300 years after Charlemagne, and probably even starting from Domitian, the emperor. No, sorry, Diocletian. Starting from the Emperor Diocletian, I think you do see in Europe a movement towards a indentured tenant-based system of socio-economic organization that you don't see prior to that.
Now both I am and the Bronze have said their piece. Now it's time for my piece. For a quick refresher, in this room, well, we're not in a room, but fuck it. I am the one who believes that feudalism, as it is commonly understood, did not exist in a substantive quality, on the basis of two more or less categories. First, for a thing to be a thing, it requires to be internally consistent to a degree, which, as I hope to show to all, it wasn't. And second, feudalism, as it is often described, is described as a uniquely European phenomenon. And while the question of Indian feudalism is marred by accusations of colonialism, with good reason to be fair in some capacity, that is not so much the case when discussing Japan, and indeed, fact, some areas of the Muslim world. So, to base this on, let's go with the example of let's compare and contrast, say, Italy and Germany, for example, two areas that I am in his example were considered part of core feudalism era, especially after Matilda of Canossa died. And I invoke here a particular and violent distinction, that of the Communal Revolution. Now, for those of you unaware, the Communal Revolution is a term by which the violent seizure of autonomy and civic rights by many a city in the Italian peninsula, and it was called revolution because it was fairly violent, often happening on with the backdrop of the Guelphs versus Ghibellines conflicts. In Italy, it was a fairly violent affair, while in, say, Germany itself, France, basically everywhere else, give or take, really, it was a largely passive affair in which it was the king encouraging and giving these rights to the cities. In Portuguese and Spanish, these are the fueros, being a kind of local autonomy. Well, to be fair, the fueros are a bit different because like city charters were given to the cities, fueros could be given to an abstractly defined region, not necessarily a single settlement. Plus, fueros were typically also had a motivation, also had like settlements, like to get people to live in that particular area motivations, as opposed to civic charters, which were more or less like just urban environments. The sheer fact of this, it demonstrates that why was it violent in Italy and passive everywhere else? The truth is because all of these countries are operating under a different system that only through, in my opinion, essentially poor historiography, got rendered statistically the same. Because another element that is mentioned here is, for example, that feudalism is seen historically as very hierarchical. There is a king, there is an emperor, there is a duke, and the hierarchy between them is very solid and almost unshakable. And yet, we have various accounts. I, in fact, remember a particular one where the King of France went to pay homage to the Duke of Brittany in the period where the Duke of Brittany was independent from France, yet still held the title of Duke. This is not exactly the highest indication of, of the extreme stratification often implied with the system. More to the point, this is not necessarily a rare affair. We have more or less substantial recordings of paying of homage to various border lords and fairly minor dignitaries when considering their nominal title, dukes, counts, free counts, etc. Often a far cry from the prestige and supposed status of a king. To add to this, we also have the sheer number of particularities within every single system. Iberian feudalism, which can be subdivided into Portuguese, Castilian, Leonese, Aragonese, Catalan feudalism, is all of them unique, though with their similarities, of course, by force of nature most likely, and political unification, can be constructed with that of France, a single country that has two types of feudalism predominating on it, southern versus northern feudalism. The impact that rivers had on the quote unquote feudalism that radically changed the dynamics. And to bring up
Sorry. The McCosker is sort of arguing from a position that was established. I think I'll agree by the historians Elizabeth A.R. Brown and Susan Reynolds, who who argued that because of its large degree of variety, both geographically and temporally, because the sort of the concept of feudalism spans such a long time, it becomes it's no longer a useful idea to discuss to understand history because it has become too vague.
Yes.
The thing though is that you don't see this kind of I don't think that you see the kind of indentured tenantship, like legally indentured, that you see in France, Germany, Low Countries, England, England, and Spain and Italy, or parts of Italy. I don't think you see that system, that basic social relationship. I don't think that is like a pre-modern constant, and I think that there is enough.
But are you therefore excluding Hungary and especially Poland, where the peasants only really started being restricted and legally defined as like peasants much, much later than the rest of supposedly Western Europe?
I mean, in that case, then I would be happy to say that that they became feudal through this process of the kind of legal.
I would say that the sort of process of indentured servitude falls under the related term of manorialism. So I would be willing to say that Poland in the early to high medieval period was feudal but not manorial.
So you would see feudalism just as the sort of set of relations, like the obligation.
I would say that if feudalism exists, it is this set of relationships that is separate from manorialism. Because if you lump the whole thing under feudalism, I think it does become too vague, and I would maybe start. I would agree with McCusker in that if all of it's under feudalism, then that's not a very helpful term.
Because
But I think that there is a unique phenomena of this sort of type of relationship that exists in Western and Central Europe in what is vaguely considered the medieval period.
Especially because if you look at even sort of under Ivan the Terrible, he has like a professional military to a greater degree, because like
I mean, actually, but hold that thought before, because we're discussing a feudalism topic here, but I think we should also like give a few moments to break some early preconceptions. Dear listener, only the poorest of lords, or the most mentally challenged of them all, would actually send their peasants to war in an offensive capacity. Did peasants go to war? Yes, when the town or castle was under siege and they were already there to seek aid, and of course they participated on the defense. The notion that that feudal lords, whatever that concept means, that medieval rulers looked to a peasant and said, "You get a sword, we're marching on Rome now," is absolutely ludicrous and makes no sense. Under the precepts of manorialism, that lord is literally shooting himself in the foot because
well, but they did that in the 100 Years' War, like not even sort of in the very intense parts. I'm talking just like, I mean, that's the whole reason for why it was made a legal requirement. That's why they banned football and made the sport of archery like a legal requirement, that you had to be able to use bow and arrow.
because they exhausted because and here we go back to my point. This is too variable to be something in of itself, because if we are to adopt a stereotypicalized interpretation of feudalism, which is typically that of France, after all the first guy we mentioned here, Gansoff, was indeed fact French, so there is a French bias.
Also French. They're French.
One of them are French.
Medievalism in the modern context is dominated by Francophile authors.
True. Is that?
Do you mean francophone?
Francophone, sorry, yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know how they feel towards France, but I wouldn't bet against that they're Francophile. But yeah, they're Francophone is what I meant.
Because we have to realize that the peasantry were often typically divided into three classes themselves: the villeins, the semi-villeins, and the cotters, with typically military obligations falling to the semi-villeins, giving rise to the concept of the yeoman. That was the main source of medieval manpower. The issue is, by the time you go up to the 100 Years' War, this system, and to a certain degree manorialism itself, the backbone of this system, is already dying a pretty violent death. They were forced to go that because the intensity of war had already escalated. I will remind all of this that, although not mentioned as much as there was today, that feudal obligations typically said that a vassal and the vassal subjects had to give onto their lord around 40-ish days of free military service. Everything after that had to be paid. And what did the 100 Years' War also have? Tremendous amounts of mercenaries. It was the sheer extensity, longevity of the concept that completely drive that also contributed to the death of the system. Hence, why the UK was able to develop professional institutions quicker than comparatively to say France and the rest of Europe, Western Europe. Like, there are too many local anomalies that deviate from the standard path, if such a path could even be said to be standard, for me to fundamentally accept it as a thing.
But if you look at like even sort of in Germany, you have like I think Germany is a very good example of this, because there is a clear case where you have princes and local states with obligations towards the state as a whole in terms of supplying an army for the emperor, and then so that's like the imperial army, and then also you had the emperor's own army, like his personal army. That was quite common, and in general, you do have a clear kind of decentralization of power in the HRE, in obviously Italy, in France, in Spain, and in Poland, and to a lesser degree in England, that you don't get in like the Muslim world. I mean, just or sort of post-Mongol Rus, and even to a certain degree pre-Mongol Rus.
Well, I mean, I again would raise up that point, because then let's focus on Christian Rus, because fundamentally, when we're talking here about Muslim societies vis-a-vis Western feudal societies, what we're really talking about is slavery versus non-slavery. Although the conditions of serfdom are very similar to that of slavery, there was sufficient distinctions, so much so that for the purpose of this discussions, we'll focus on the biggest of them all, logistics. And I invoke the following principle. Russia, both pre and post Rus for quite a while, and both pre and post Mongol invasion for quite a while, had the bizarre category, to Western eyes, of the military slave, a very much Arabic invention, might I add. In fact, the position of heavy cavalry for quite a while in both immediately before and during and after the Mongol invasion and occupation, by both the lords, the Drazinir, and military slaves. The name escapes me, but there was this caste of literally military slaves, and they were just quite humorously inspired by like Turkic slave soldiers, were essentially kidnapped from or conscripted from a very young age and trained in the art of cavalry warfare. This was what the Muslims were doing, but on a massive scale because they had access to wider slave markets. It is. Can you truly say to me that it is inherent that this is a substantive distinction because other societies that had sufficient amounts of slaves did develop these kinds of practices? This to me is not a substantive difference on the basis of, oh, they were distinct systems, they were distinct elements.
I think because what you're pointing to there is the fact that like the Middle East was just more developed than Europe, and
But it wasn't, though, in terms of industry, it wasn't.
I mean it was like it had larger population, larger tax base. Like, yeah, I mean like the Middle East was like, you know, up until the like Enlightenment, if you were given the choice of living in London, Paris, Rome, or like
Cairo,
Cairo, Delhi, or Beijing, you would choose Cairo, Delhi, or Beijing over any European city, because any European city was just like a shithole compared to just the scale of society that they were engaged in. And yeah, I mean, I don't think that the fact that I don't think that we can say, you know, oh, it was a less economically developed society, less like a smaller society, that therefore that means that that it's like not a thing, because, you know, there's obvious places we can also point to. There's other obvious places that we can point to where you see a similar sort of thing, namely Japan and Korea and China, because Korea and Japan have social systems, and especially Japan have social systems that are incredibly similar to those that you have in Western Europe. And similarly, Japan is geographically inhospitable to large-scale empires pre railroads. It's
Well, pre Bastille more than anything, right?
yeah. Pre, pre, especially places like Germany. Like Germany just isn't a good place to have an empire for most of history. Good, like, and I mean, this is why France is more organized than it for most of for than the HRE. Or England. I mean, like England is kind of just the Thames and then York, like it, or the Humber. So you're, I, I think, I think that this is kind of pointing to the fact that Europe socioeconomics were a consequence of the fact that they were less developed. Doesn't really distract from my point. I think it helps my point in many ways. And this also, I think, explains edge cases like Umayyad Spain, because Umayyad Spain was sort of very underdeveloped compared to the Abbasids, hence why they have a society that is fairly tolerant, and sort of has hallmarks of what we would consider feudalism. They have like an organized military to a far greater degree than, say, most European countries did.
On the basis of professional slave soldiers, but
Yeah,
Right, yeah, but like the professional slave soldiers then is distinct from that system of reciprocal obligations of warrior nobility.
especially when those warrior nobility are like hereditary in a way that slave soldiers just aren't. Like slave soldier, yeah, like you own slave soldiers and then they're sort of inherited. Um, but it's not like a self-reproducing military caste, in the same way that say it was in Western Europe. That's why you get the different periods of the Mamluks.
Yeah, I think it is a useful enough distinction that it does like deserve a word to talk about it. I just think right now, especially like outside of a very academic context, like in the common parlance, the word feudalism is doing too much work. It's being used to sort of explain every facet of Europe in the broadly defined Middle Ages, and I don't think that's useful. But I think if you make the use of the word more precise to talk about this specific sort of set of relationships that is fairly unique to Europe, sort of it with I mean that's it's a truth with modifications. I think it then becomes a useful concept, but I think we have to be precise when we use the word.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the two places that you see a social system like feudalism, um, is Europe and Japan. Like I don't, and specifically about these kinds of military relationships, I don't
I
think you see. I
I,
don't
I
think.
reject that statement. Early, basically pre-Han Dynasty era China. You
Okay,
have
but okay, yeah. I mean, I'll agree there. Like pre-Han Dynasty China, but like
still,
um
still over 300 years. Supposedly more time than than some interpretations of the duration of European feudalism.
Well, that is also another big question: is when is the feudalism?
more so when it
I
ended than when it started. Everyone, I think we can all agree that Charlemagne began what we can superficially understand as feudalism.
I think feudalism ends with absolutism.
I mean, I don't.
So like
I do fundamentally agree with that take, actually. Um, but like, if it were a thing, if it indeed is to be considered a thing in and of itself, it would begin with Charlemagne and it would end with the rise of with the rise of absolutism.
yeah, and I think that is
That makes sense.
that's a substantive period of time, because I think also if you look at this like based around reciprocal relations of warrior nobility, the core thing there is the warrior nobility and military obligations. And when you start getting proper professional militaries, not just ad hoc hirings of mercenaries, then I think you can start talking about an end um, to feudalism. And obviously, manorialism, if you or serfdom, only dies um, like post French Revolution.
With that statement, or more accurately, with half of that statement. With serfdom, yes, manorialism was clearly dead by the time the Renaissance happened. Like it was clearly dead. Like the structures of manorialism would not, for example, allow something like mercantilism to have even been conceptualized.
Yeah, I would also put the death of manorialism before the death of feudalism.
It was already dying before, but it definitely took a turn for the immediate, very quick death right now, right the fuck now after the Black Plague.
I think the Black Plague.
I mean, you can. I would. I mean, I do not consider it wrong to say that it was the Black Plague that killed it.
Well, yeah, I think I mean, the Black Death was a very big social change in Europe. Sort of really changed massive amounts. Um, like I don't think the Renaissance would have been possible without the Black Death. Um,
Outside of the topic of outside of the topic of this, and while I don't disagree, there is some discussion to be had on that because like the Renaissance was for the most part like an historiographical creation. People living under the Renaissance did not recognize it as a distinct period of the
no, they
past.
did.
They created Gothicism. Yes, there
No,
was
no, 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 no,
No,
no.
no. I mean, but
They
I mean,
knew they were in a special period of time because they thought the world was going to end imminently.
okay.
Like that's the if you really want to talk about a distinctive thing in Renaissance in the Renaissance, it's an extreme apocalypticism. I don't think that there's any other serious distinguishing feature beyond like the fact that they start using light or something in artwork, which is not a
single point perspective, maybe.
yeah, like that's not a good way to maybe it's useful in art history, but it's not useful as a sociological thing. What is distinct sociologically in the Renaissance from preceding medieval time periods is extreme apocalypticism.
Fair enough. I concede the point. I was wrong.
So this is where I think people like art historians are like, oh, they didn't think that they were in the Renaissance. Are like just sort of ignoring the fact that you know uh, when the bonfire of the vanities was set up by what's his face in Florence.
Savonarola.
Yeah, Savonarola. The artists all happily threw their degenerate artwork on the fire because they were sort of caught up in this massive period of apocalypticism. And like Pico and Ficino, the two great Renaissance philosophers, both believed that their work would bring about the end of the world. So there is a clear run through in the Renaissance that you don't see in earlier medieval time periods, which is extreme focus on apocalypticism and then on personal subjectivity, which you see with groups like the spiritual Franciscans, and like just like apostolic poverty, which is not it's not as much of a thing to be into apostolic poverty in preceding time periods, and this is a response to the Black Death.
Or yeah, the Black Death, which is sort of the hallmark of, to borrow a phrase from Barbara Tuchman, the calamitous 14th century.
Yeah.
If if everything, because like you have to imagine, like if you are living in the 14th century, everything is going wrong.
Yeah.
You're right. So it's very easy then to start believing that maybe
If you're a 15th century and 16th century person, you look back, and the Christianity says before the second coming, things will get worse before they get better. Clearly, they've gotten much worse in the preceding time periods. So maybe the world's going to end soon. And
yeah, it's also getting a lot colder. So a lot more harvests are failing, and
yeah.
and there's all these schisms. So it's very clear. So I think that's sort of like this heightened sense of apocalyptic crisis.
Yeah, and this is something.
Distinguishing.
Yeah,
no, I agree with that.
And this is something that you don't see, when 100 years later with Descartes, Descartes still has it somewhat. There's this kind of, but it shifts towards like a kind of scientific rationalism. But that's a bad word for it, because it's like, it's sort of, that's when you get the rise of like Rosicrucianism and like organized esotericism in Europe, in like, Freemasonry and so forth.
So like a kind of anti-apocalypticism. Yeah, the belief.
No, it's still fairly apocalyptic in places. I mean, I'm of the opinion that, especially with someone like Descartes, if you read between the lines, there is this kind of, because it's the quest for absolute certainty. Like and there's no real like historical consciousness in Descartes, which you do kind of get actually in some of the Renaissance philosophers. Like, he's aware that there's prior philosophers, but he doesn't think that like philosophy develops or anything. It's just like you have certainty, and then once you achieve the certainty through like spiritual exercises, basically, things are overcome. And this is kind of that I've gotten quite off topic now.
Yeah, I think possibly this could be the topic.
Yeah.
We're teasing a lot of episodes.
Yeah,
here.
I think this is quite an interesting topic. I think.
But art historians in the comments watching, but talking about, don't worry, we have some art history ideas.
Yeah, I mean, I just think I referenced it just because it's the whole like anti-Renaissance thing is just kind of an edgy take that people like to have, because it's kind of obviously trivially true that people did not think that they were going through the Renaissance. But then like we also talk about the early moderns, but like none of those people would have thought that they were the early moderns. And like
just as we now don't think whatever it is that this period will be called the late moderns or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's why I think it's this like, and it, because the Renaissance is just a fancy name. It's just sort of whatever. But
made up by an art historian.
Yeah, made up by an art historian. So then his later people have to own him.
Made by an art historian who hated the medieval period.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's sort of I think.
Okay, but I think I think that one thing's a certain is we're getting massively off track.
So I mean, well, the other thing I will say, at least about like, I think where this is relevant is if you look at medieval art, so sort of pre-Renaissance art, high medieval art it's very sort of it's closer to the kind of to what we might consider primitive art, like what you would sort of say what Native Americans might make, where the point is not realism. The point is um,
You could have used it was you could have used the term it was iconographic.
yeah, anti-realist art. And so like, like there's medieval art, like high medieval art pieces where you just see putrefying corpses like of Christ, and you're meant to like contemplate that. And it's not particularly realistic, it's just like horrific. And this is sort of, I think this can be quite clearly contrasted, I think, with the kinds of art that are being made at the same time in the Middle East, which are highly focused upon like geometric patterns and mathematics, basically, because they're essentially mathematical exercises. It's only actually later on, after the Christians moved towards realism, that you then get like the Persian miniature period, like the Turkish Turco-Persian miniature period, where you then get spiritual representations of birds and like scenes from the Quran. In the earlier period, it's very like it's mathematics. So I think that's an interesting point to be made that about, and I think that is in part because the Middle East just had like more intelligent people going around teaching mathematics and so forth, had better mathematics.
But what is interesting is that in music, I think almost like the you have the opposite phenomenon, where in the medieval period, if you look at their music, it's almost very mathematical in a way, what with all your perfect fifth harmonies, and the Tartini notes and so forth, and then it gets less mathematical for a good while until you get to Bach.
Mm. Yeah, I mean that is interesting. I think I'm not exactly sure why, but I think it is it's I think just fundamentally the basic reason to get back to feudalism, I don't think that you can say that there was like professional militaries in Europe.
But you can't say that though. Like yeomen were clearly, at the very least, in part, draw their livelihood from their military work and were trained for the job. Like there was the yeomanry was a thing, and by all definitions of the word professional, they were at least professional in the sense that they were trained for the job. I mean, I could even
But
invoke.
they were a caste though, weren't they?
I mean,
Like they were like a social caste.
Well,
So,
the word yeoman originally refers to a servant in a noble or royal household, but then sort of changed into like someone who serves their lord by going to war in a sort of this professionalized way.
yeah, and to use a
but
more
is that a socially inheritable like class?
not necessarily, but it could often be. It largely wasn't because their life expectancy wasn't that high. Let's be honest. But to get
Yes, it's this sort of caste, sort of for a brief period until it becomes a rank.
yeah, and why not why go with the yeomen when I can just go crossbowmen in general? They were.
I mean, crossbows, like any dumbass can use them. What do you mean by like? Do you mean archers or like?
No, crossbowmen.
There was a sort of like many groups of crossbowmen. Not, I wouldn't say crossbowmen blank, but there is, especially in the sort of southern. You don't see this as much as in England, but like with the Genoese and so forth, there is this sort of like crossbowmen combined arms mercenary force that
I mean,
arrived.
but even outside of mercenaries, like Portugal, the earliest census in this country is not a census, although we call it as that because we are ashamed that we only started doing census in the 60s. Yes, we only started doing censuses in the 60s. It was the holdbesteders, oh god, how do I translate this? The list, the list of crossbowmen of the country, and that was just what it was, a list of the crossbowmen that could be called on the spot for military service. I mean, this is kind of important because crossbowmen originally played a very important role in proto-tertial formations. If I can say that term without the military historians killing me on the spot.
How many types of historian have we made enemies of in this episode? I don't know.
So many.
So,
Okay, but
but I think that's getting.
would you grant that the kinds of militaries that they had in Europe were far less professional than those that you see under absolutism and under like in the Middle East, like Muslim slave armies?
I mean, here's the issue, because like if we the issue is not even that of substance, is that of time. Because if you'd asked me, okay, McCosk, late Middle Ages, so your 13th century, 100 years war armies, more or less professional than Muslim slave armies, my answer would be self-evidently more. Because, the hallmark of a professional soldier is not cooping the fucking country, as a matter of fact. At the same time, if you ask me, okay, Muslim slave armies, this
I don't think that the hallmark.
Let me finish.
I don't think that the hallmark of professional soldier is not cooing the country.
I think it's very hard for non-professional soldiers to do coups.
Think it's exactly the opposite. And I mean,
like if the soldiers are sort of are in a position to do a coup, I think because like if you collect because I think there's like a unique dynamic of crossbowmen and yeomen, but I think the crossbowmen are engaging in this network of reciprocal relationships. I think.
Yeah, I mean, mercenaries I think can be seen as feudal because you're, especially when it's like the kinds of mercenary companies that you see in Italy.
Okay. Then let me shift my example. I'll concede on the point of using the coup example being dumb on my part, but not giving up this point just yet. The issue is a matter of time, because while the professionalization of Muslim armies, slave troops, varied, ebbed and flowed with time, you clearly have in quote unquote European feudalism a overall general upwards trend towards professionalization. For example, all of Europe by the time more or less of the 16th to 17th century had adopted the regimental standard. For comparison, Persia only adopted the regimental standard in an effective capacity in 1923, because until that point, all the fucking regiments were were literally paper units for the purposes of fucking high level corruption and bribery. The issue is the time spans involved in order for any of these claims to make sense is so weird and bizarre that I can just not accept it. Because
But I don't think regimental standards are like a hallmark of professional militaries.
I mean, regimental. When I'm not saying regimental standard. I said the regimental system. I'm referring.
Regimental system.
Yeah, so when the troops were professionalized at the level of the regiment, but everything else above the regiment was ad hoc. That's what I.
Well, so the reason why I would say that that Persia did have a professional military in a way that, say, England didn't, is because it had centralized government control over military production.
That is a claim.
Post Safavid, it definitely did, and pre that as well.
But it didn't have that in the Qajar era. They were literally reliant.
But the Qajar era, I think, is outside of this because that's post. We're not talking about like
Qajar era is you into it's modern. It's fully into the modern that there can exist some sort of weird slide back is a different phenomenon.
Yeah, and I mean, also the Qajars were just kind of like shit. Like that's why what you're describing is the fact that it was like a poorly functioning social system, which is why they were then cooed by the Pahlavis. Like, I mean, you're like, I don't think it's a good example. Ottomans would probably be a better example if you wanted to give an example because they were still pretty like with it.
Yeah, I could have used the rise and fall of the, not the Mamelukes. Oh God, what was the name of the
Janissaries? But the Janissaries are a good example of this. Like the
Janissaries are very professional.
They were very professional. They stopped being professional, and then the Turkish government eliminated them. They did like a night of long knives basically on them. So you know, like the I think the Ottoman Empire, like clearly, you know, the Ottoman Empire is a modern, like a comparatively modern centralized bureaucracy that has clear systems of inheritance for most of its time period. It's relatively constitutional for most of its time period. Like you know, a Christian would probably be treated better in the Ottoman Empire than they would in Romania or Hungary, just like at the legal level.
Use the term like legal, like lawful, rather than
Yeah.
because the constitutional periods in Ottoman history were incredibly short. In fact,
But like like consistent equality before the law, basically.
Within their own religious group.
Within their own religion. I mean, even between religions, I think, you know, like you wouldn't want to be a Jew in Romania or even a German in Romania for most of history. So
Transylvanian Saxons had it good, but no.
Yeah, so like you know, like
but also they did in the period we're discussing. Technically, they didn't live in Romania.
Well,
technically, I mean, Romania didn't exist as a concept, but
yeah, it didn't exist as a place. I mean, it did sort of exist as a concept.
As a concept, it didn't exist as a state, at least.
Yeah.
That
Transylvania, the Duchy of Transylvania, the Kingdom of Transylvania, or East Hungary, Transylvania, where the Transylvanian Saxons settled, did exist, and this was a medieval phenomenon in part of the larger part of the larger, like, let's bring Germans here movement that was ongoing.
Yeah, there was also Transylvanian Italians as well, and a bunch of other people.
Transylvanian Saxons were an earlier thing than the let's bring Germans here. The let's bring Germans here was with the Banat, and that was because the wars between the Ottomans and the Austrians and Hungarians led to the depopulation of the border region. But the point that I'm trying to make is that if you're an ethnic or religious minority in Europe, you don't exist. Like you're a non-person, and that's how Jews existed in Europe. If you are a ethnic or religious minority in under Muslim rule, and you aren't a slave, you have far greater degrees of legal and social equality than Europe will get prior to the French Revolution. That's
a bit overly unfair for Europe. Like French Revolution, are pushing it a bit too back. Come on now. Like Italy.
I'm serious. Like you, like what about anti gypsy laws in Europe? That like I mean the kidnapping of like Switzerland. If you want to talk about stuff like blood tax in the Muslim world, the Europeans were doing essentially the same thing with ethnic minorities until like the 1960s. So
I think we've gotten a bit off topic here.
yeah, but like my point is that very clearly, at the time when we can talk about feudalism post Charlemagne, the comparable societies are going to be Russia, Scandinavia, and the Muslim world. Muslim world is clearly more identifiably modern, as we might
it is at least different.
Yeah, and then if you look at Russia's social organization is far more. It's almost tribal in like large social blocks. You see similar things in the Balkans for a very long time period. This sort of very clannish system society, which is a result of the geography in both cases. And then
this is sort of the earlier Russia. Well, I think we'll get back on a different occasion to the sort of complicated phenomenon that is Russia from the Mongols to Catherine the Great.
Yeah, and yeah, and then Scandinavia is just sort of like barely populated. Like it's sort of because of the fact that it's like culturally, economically dependent upon Europe, and then it's sort of barely populated. It's not even clannish, basically. For like it's not even socially developed enough to be clannish, basically, as far as I can tell.
There's sort of like there's sort of like broad. I think there's like a small period from like the late 12th century to the late 13th century where you could say it's feudal but not manorial, which is like during the time of the Norwegian Civil War. But then it's sort of like full. But before and after that, it's sort of. But even that century is sort of complicated. But yeah, there's a bunch of stuff going on that makes it. I don't think it's feudalist before or after that.
Okay, to start heading towards the end of this episode, because we didn't. Well, I personally at least want to make this a 2-hour episode. Let's focus on manorialism, because that was kind of the make or break point for bronze in like the reach of feudalism. So how would you define manorialism?
So manorialism is, I think, and I, I mean, I know that McCosk probably is going to problematize this definition, but essentially, it is also a network of reciprocal economic relationships, in which the person who labors, the laboratori, we can refer to him as a peasant if you want, exchanges sort of in return to have land of his own to work on. He gives up labor to work on the land of the person with whom he has made this contract.
Okay.
Very broadly defined, like like the exact terms of such an. Essentially, it's a network of reciprocal economic agreements.
Okay, Bronze, you had to give that definition in the way you almost had to work hard so that I could not agree with that definition, because like what kind of like almost all economic relationships, almost all economical systems can be characterized as an economical as a reciprocal economic relationships to some degree.
But it's not that like it's like they're reciprocal. It's that there is a sort of like a very relationship of like, I will work for you if you give me, enough means that I can sort of support myself. Like if I'll work on your land, you'll give me you'll lease me.
you'll give me protection. No, like that's not the part I'm against. I'm against the specific word can be defined as a series of reciprocal economic relations, because any economic system can be defined under those terms.
Yeah, well, then I've specified what those agreements are.
Yeah,
Right.
to say that manorialism, I would not problematize in your again outside of questioning your word choice. I would actually further add to your definition, not necessarily criticize them, that the focus on autarky, because manorialism at its core is autarky personified.
I would agree it's very autarkical, yeah.
And not profit driven. Like it's all like it's autarky. Period. There is no extract surplus wealth, or even the notion of surplus really, for as long as manorialism dies. Manorialism is simply not concerned with anything but autarky and like survival.
I mean, you do get the remnants of like manorialism, like especially in the sort of social position of like uh the esquire in like England, sort of village life in England, where it's sort of centralized, socially centralized around like a local landowner. That's a thing for quite a while, but I think
That's the thing anyway. But I
I
believe
think the ghost of manorialism is very long lived.
I think Bronze and I would agree that that is more a consequence of serfdom in of itself, or like or even the shire-based organization, rather than necessarily the economic system. Though they're both long.
yeah, because like most government jobs in England were volunteer only until the 19th century.
Yeah.
So like justices of the peace were not paid until like the 19th century, which is kind of insane because justices of the peace were what they had in England before police officers. So basically the police weren't paid until the 19th century.
You want to hear better? The what is it called? The Holy Band of Spain. Basically, the police force for literal centuries until like the 19th century as well, voluntary, unpaid.
I mean,
And it's in Portugal where we go turbo with the police. Our first police force were our Royal Guard, the Royal Guard of Police of Lisbon and Porto, literally picked from the best mans in the army.
I mean, yeah, this is why you get stuff like the Vogelfrei system in like Germany, where you just declare someone an outlaw, and then you can kill them, and then it's like that's how you deal with crime.
I mean, outlawry was a thing everywhere, really. Like, you only start to see outlawry, like the concept, the legal position of the outlaw only starts really being completely abolished in Europe with the foundation of the UN. That's when the last remnants of that start going away.
Anyway, but yeah, I think do you mean the League of Nations or the UN?
The League of Nations, yeah, sorry.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, I think
that's quite enough ideas for one.
Yeah, I think we've covered a lot.
We've covered a lot, and at the same time, not that much. But I think that's a good start.
Yeah, I think we can probably discuss manorialism more, or we could discuss the Renaissance next week. I think, in 2 weeks.
Yeah, no, like
But we can figure that out.
The end of one leads very naturally, in the end of manorialism, the economic system, and like the rise of mercantilism, and the greater exchange of ideas, and like apocalypticism, etc., leads very naturally into one another. So I think we can do that.
Yeah, that would be good. I think. But yeah, so this has been
schedule. This is the first on MU history.
Yeah, well, I think we're in a bit of a flow. We're in a flow state, as it were. Now we need to do some agile and do some yeah.
Scrum.
Yeah, a few scrums. Yeah. I
An
can't.
idea board going. Yeah.
Yeah, I can't think of any more corporate speak.
We need to synergize.
Yeah, synergize. Yeah, we're synergizing at the moment. We need to continue synergizing. This has been Monarchism Unfiltered. I'm Iam.
Bronze.
I've been McCosk.
And we've been
Nice.
discussing feudalism. So yeah, we'll see you in 2 weeks.
Yeah. For some more synergy. Good night.